Master.
It's, good morning,ค่ะ. Thank you very much for being here in this room and on Zoom,นะคะ. Ambassador Pat Byrne has long career of diplomat. He's a very successful. He's an ambassador of Ireland in Singapore and also the ambassador of Ireland in Thailand. Prior to this experience, he has long service working in the ministry. Okay, and he also at one point of time had the work experience in development cooperation division, experience throughout Asia Pacific, Middle East, in Europe,นะคะ, all over the place. So it's such an honor to have you today. We'll begin with introducing you first. Dr. David Rose, are you here? So I can introduce you as well. Dr. David Rose.
Yes, hello, I'm here.
You can't hear him. Just a moment. A moment.
No worries.
All right. Let's see. We can't hear Dr. David Rose. So then I'll just intro one person at a time, then wait until the signal's back for the sound,นะคะ.
Good.
Okay,ค่ะ. Ambassador, you're ready? The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Sawadee krap, everybody. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you this morning. My name, as you just heard, is Pat Byrne, and I have the honor to be the Irish ambassador in Thailand since August of 2022. And I have to say, it's a job I'm thoroughly enjoying. Everyone's been very warm and very welcoming since I arrived, and it's been an absolute treat to be representing Ireland in Thailand. I suppose the main reason I'm here today is sort of to do with my own personal story, because I have a very severe visual impairment. I was born with a congenital eye condition called Stargardt's disease, which is, I think, named after a Scandinavian scientist. And basically it means that my macula has degenerated since I was very young, to the point now where I have about 25% vision in my two eyes. So it's sort of like age-related macular degeneration where people's eyesight fade as they get older, except in my case, it started when I was a teenager. So it first manifested itself when I was about 16 or 17 years old, and I had kind of trouble seeing the blackboard in school and trouble reading ordinary print, and it just got steadily worse and worse and worse, and wasn't actually diagnosed until I was in my late 20s. But so it's a condition I've been living with now for 4 decades, and it's now reached the point where my eyesight is actually quite, my vision is quite low. So I have a big blank spot in the center of my vision. It's kind of like the hole in the donut. So if I look directly at something, it's just a black hole. And also I have very a lot of trouble with fine vision. So that if you see my notes today, they're printed in the biggest font I can make on the computer, and even then I still have trouble reading them. So so I have to have a good memory. But I suppose the point of all of this is that despite that challenge, despite the fact that my vision has been deteriorating since I was a teenager, and that there's no treatment for this, there's no cure for it. I can't wear spectacles, I can't wear lenses. Despite all of that, I have still been able to have a career, I hope a successful career, but certainly to be independent economically and financially, to look after my family, to raise 2 children and put them through university, and to make, I think, and I hope, a positive and a meaningful contribution in my organization, which in my case is the Irish Foreign Ministry, and therefore on behalf of my country, and I hope on behalf of the European Union as well. And it was not easy, I have to say. I've been, listening to Chun Cassette in the earlier session, talking about the achievements of, on the one hand, the authoritarian societies, communist societies, and the other hand, the Western liberal democracies, in terms of looking after basic needs for people who are vulnerable or disadvantaged or disabled. And that is true now to a great extent, but it's still far from perfect, even in Western Europe and the European Union. And it was certainly challenging when I was first experiencing this difficulty in the 1980s in Ireland. Ireland at that stage was just in transition from being a very poor agrarian society to becoming a more modern, prosperous, industrialized society. We had only just joined the European Union, and the reality of life was that Ireland was a very poor country, that access to employment or education or other services for people with disabilities was still a very mixed picture. The reality was that if you, rather like Chun Cassette described it earlier, if you were middle class or you had wealth of your own, you could access the services. But if you're poor or working class, it was a very different situation and a challenge. There was no legislation, there was no rights-based approach, and also the social attitudes of the country were very influenced by the Catholic Church, which was very dominant, and that led to a very charity-focused, very patronistic approach to disability, so that people who with mobility disabilities, or people who are blind, or people who are deaf, were often put away into institutional care, where they could be looked after and where their basic needs could be, served and so forth, usually in a good way, in an adequate way, looked after by religious orders or by civil society organizations or by the state in some cases. But there was no approach that encouraged or promoted people in these categories to be independent, to have their own, to pursue educational opportunities, to pursue careers, and to fulfill their potential in society. So it wasn't easy, but it has gotten easier over the years. So, I mean, to some extent, I had a lot to battle against and managed to do it. To a large extent, through my career, and particularly the early part of my career, I did that by largely keeping my disability a secret, by not telling people about it, by not sharing it, because I felt that might put me at a disadvantage. Later on, that's become easier to do. And what are the things that have made it easier in Ireland? Well, I would say first and foremost, it is the modernization of our society, coupled with our membership of the European Union, and being able to benefit from the knowledge and the values and the research and the education and understanding that has happened in countries like Sweden and the Netherlands and Germany and all the very progressive Western liberal democracies that Chun Cassette mentioned earlier, leading to a better understanding of issues around disability and the role of people with disabilities and people with disadvantages in society, and a much more strong commitment to genuine equality, genuine inclusion in our society. And that has, again, not happened by accident. It has had to be led by the government and led by the Parliament in terms of introducing, changes to legislation, reform of legislation, to create the right environment and landscape for this. And that has happened, at the very top in terms of our Constitution, and enshrining in the Constitution the right to equality for all citizens. That then follows into our laws, where we have adopted laws to guarantee non-discrimination against people on the basis of a whole series of grounds, one of which, for example, is disability. There's also religious belief, ethnic background, sexuality, and so forth. So that we have very strong equality legislation, again, inspired by and encouraged by our European Union neighbors. And what that means is that, you know, it's against the law for a company, for an organization in Ireland to discriminate somebody who wants to get a job there, who wants to get, who wants to advance their career in an organization. So there's that provides a great legal safety net for disadvantaged people, for minorities, for people with disabilities to be able to pursue their careers. There has also been fantastic progress in terms of education, and education is absolutely key, and it's education for all parties. There is education needed for general society, and that is done through our mainstream education system, where from the earliest age, children are taught about equality, they're taught about the rights-based approach, they're taught about the principles of non-discrimination, they're taught about disability and how to understand and how to relate to it and other minority situations and conditions and so forth. There's also education for people with disabilities, and I would be an example of that. I mean, for most of for much of my life, I really didn't understand what my rights were. I didn't understand what my entitlements were. I wasn't empowered by education about my condition or about Irish society enough to demand my rights and demand to be treated equally. I kind of thought, well, you know, I work in an organization where I'm the only one who has an eyesight problem, so you know, I can't really expect them to accommodate me. But then, as I became educated, I realized that I had a legal right and a legal entitlement to, you know, what is the normal phrase is all reasonable accommodations for my condition, and that meant that I could ask for special technology, special assistance, extra time to do things when I was doing exams, for example, in university or in the education system, special tools in terms of maybe larger font exam papers or enlargement screens or magnifiers and so forth to do what I needed to do. And these were all then provided to me, and that all made my life easier. And that takes me to another point. I'm sorry, just to finish on the education point, it's education at all levels. So, you know, organizations and managers need to be educated, teachers need to be educated, media need to be educated, people involved in communications and so forth, because there needs to be created the right narrative and the right way of handling these issues in all forms of society. So it's very important throughout. Technology has been a huge enabler for me, and I can't understate that. You know, I think as well as all those challenges that were legal and structural and so forth, I also felt experienced genuine practical challenges of how to read things, how to see things. And I must say, thanks to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and all these guys who receive a lot of criticism, but I'll always be indebted to them, because you know, maybe 20 years ago when I thought, you know, I wouldn't be able to work any longer, along they come with you know, computers and larger fonts and applications like JAWS and so forth, and iPhones with VoiceOver and Siri and you know, voice to text, text to voice, and they're all fantastic, and it really enabled me to make the most of my career and my potential through that technology. And that is now, it's now cheap, it's now accessible, it's now global, it's now there for everyone who has a smartphone or everyone who has a laptop or a tablet or whatever. And that's fantastic. That's a great leveler. That's a great enabler, and that's a thing that all societies should really, you know, take advantage of to the full. I'm not going to speak for much longer. I mean, some of the other things that have certainly been done in Ireland and done in civil society is encouragement and providing frameworks for organisations, from government departments to the private sector, to have consultation and meaningful dialogues within the organizations about the needs of minority groups, of people with disabilities and so forth, so that they can have a voice in how the organizations are run and how their needs are addressed, which is very, very important. There's been encouragement and incentives for positive action, things like tax incentives and other write-off incentives to encourage companies to employ people with disabilities or mental health issues or other challenges and bring them into the workforce. There's been a lot of research and information published and promoted around the economic benefits of including minorities and people with disabilities into the workforce, making the workforce more diverse. I mean, it's not just that, you know, if you exclude 20% of your population from the workforce, you're losing 20% of your potential GDP or revenue or whatever. It's actually much more than that, because the creativity and the diversity and the different perspectives and the different ideas that these different groups and people with disabilities can bring, you know, can add much more value than just the individual, you know, the sum of the parts, so to speak. And you need only think of you know, where would we be, you know, if Beethoven had been told you can't be a composer because you're deaf, or if James Joyce had been told you can't be a writer because you're blind, or if Franklin D. Roosevelt had been told you can't be a politician because you're in a wheelchair. You know, I mean, it's bizarre that we even think about excluding people with disabilities from the workforce today, and yet it still happens. So there are all sorts of other mechanisms, and I'd be happy to talk about any of them that I can in Q&A as well. But I would say that that very important as well is to have events like this to surface these issues, to have visibility around disability issues, to talk about them, to exchange views on them, to debunk myths around them, to show good experiences of people with disabilities, to have champions and advocates for the causes, but also, again, to increase the knowledge base, to educate people, to enable people to better understand the issues, and therefore, I suppose, make a positive change and make a positive difference. And that's why, as well as being an ambassador of Ireland, during my time in Thailand and during whatever time I have left in my career, I'm also happy to be an ambassador for disability, an ambassador for equality, an ambassador for inclusion. I pledge myself to that cause and to any support I can give to it during my time here. So I leave it there. Thank you very much, Captain McCrabb, for listening to me, and as I said, more than happy to engage in a discussion, and looking forward also to listening to David Rose. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for sharing. Your story is very impressive. One time, I watched a movie, Hidden Figures, at NASA. It was the first time to have a mathematician who's a woman, and NASA never knows how to create a restroom for women, and she happens to be African American. So they never have a restroom for a Black woman at that time, they call. So she has to walk miles and long time to get to the restroom and come back. And your story resonates that, to be the first in your ministry, right? To be the first in your ministry to have this challenge. And thank you for sharing your story so much. You have time to wait for Dr. David Rose to share his lecture, and then we'll do the Q&A all at once. All right. Thank you very much. Dr. David Rose, are you on screen?
Yes,
you ready?
hello.
Okay.
Can you hear me
So
now?
let me read his profile a little bit. Associate Professor Rose is Vice President of the International Association of Schools of Social Work, or we call IASSW. He's representing Asia Pacific and the President of Asia Pacific Association for School Social Work and Education, we call APASW. Professor is also Director of Teaching and Learning at the Department of Social Work at the University of Melbourne, where he teaches in the MSW and Entry to Practice program in the area of legal and ethical context of practice and social program design evaluation. He has long-term practice and research interest in the areas of mental health, alcohol, drug use issues, family support, domestic and family violence, and criminal justice system. I think we have the best speakers today for the Asia Pacific. So I'm going to give you a cue. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3. Dr. Ross, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Wana. And I can just check you can hear me now, okay? And
we cannot hear you yet.
yeah.
ในห้องไม่ได้ยินนะคะ เดี๋ยวนะคะแป๊บหนึ่ง just a moment
No
Yeah.
worries.
can you say something a little bit like
Yes, hello,
Testing.
can you hear me? Testing.
not yet can we hear him in Zoom
Yes, I'm not sure.
one moment จินต้องตามเดี๋ยว we will find the hotel technician one moment sir
All good.
but we cannot hear you from we can see your PowerPoint but we
Good.
cannot hear you yet and there's an echo just a moment technician one moment or shall we take questions for the ambassador first เดี๋ยวพี่ปัญหาคืออะไรคะเดี๋ยวดูสายหลุดบ้างเสียงไม่เข้าเกิดจากอะไรคะsure please okay
Dr. Rose.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me now? Testing.
We can hear you right now.
Hello, testing. Can you hear? Can you hear me now? Great, thank you. All right, well, I'll start. So thank you, Juana, for the introduction, and also thank you for the presentation from the ambassador, a great introduction to this area. And I don't think much of what I've got to say is really different than that. So, but really I'm trying to look at this a little bit too from a social work perspective around our response as social workers. So hello to everyone. Sawadee krap. Lovely to join you here this afternoon, where I am here in Melbourne, Australia, but lovely that we can have this session. So looking at this area of people with disabilities towards financial stability, I'll just really start, and it's going to be a fairly brief presentation. Why is inclusion of people with disabilities in employment important? So why would we be wanting to do that? Some of the models of disability, and this very much picks up on, I think, what the ambassador has just been through there, of looking at some of those historical ways disability and employment, etc., has been looked at. What some of the connections between the two, and what can we take, I guess, as a social work perspective around this. So why is participation in employment important? We're obviously talking here about physical disability, but also remembering intellectual disability, mental health related disabilities, sensory disabilities, other disabilities that are equally also important to look at as far as participation in the workforce, and some of the benefits that then flow from that on all sorts of levels. So, you know, improving employment outcomes for people with a disability has benefits at many different levels. So obviously for the person themselves and their family and their ability to receive an income and to have a quality of life that goes with that. Also workplaces, I think the ambassador mentioned, and there's much research which says having a very diverse workplace, having people coming from different backgrounds, particularly different disabilities, but also obviously other areas of diversity as well, are likely to lead to really good workplaces, productive workplaces, and to have real strengths in having that diversity within the workplace. Obviously the economy, because people are then earning an income, and often in that sense, not needing to have other sort of supports or benefits that might be provided by the government and the broader community by having, you know, what is a very large proportion of the community who experience different disabilities actively engaged in the economy and what goes with that. So lots of actual benefits as to why I would be looking at increasing the workplace force participation of people who are experiencing disabilities. So for the individual with a disability, some of the benefits of this include increased income, higher standard of living, less reliance on government benefits and supports and demand for welfare systems, financial independence, a sense of identity and positive health impacts. So lots of good benefits flowing there. For workplaces who then employ employees who have a disability, then don't miss out on that diverse range of skills and talents that people will bring to that. Some of the research says that there's higher retention of those workers within the workplace and fewer health and safety issues. So lots of benefits there for both the individual and for the workplace where those employment would be taking place. So this section picks up a little bit on some of those areas that the ambassador talked about in the first presentation. So, you know, really for us as social workers, when we then start to look at this area, we can see there's been 4 you know, key models identified as ways of looking at disability, and this obviously links really closely to then workforce participation and how people go there. So the medical model, the charity model, the social model, and the human rights model. And in many respects, historically, social workers as part of practice in the disability area have been involved in all of these different types of models, and we'll run through them in a moment. But just to say, in our current modern times, we obviously are really aiming towards focusing towards the social model and the human rights model as really important ways to guide practice in this area. So the medical model of disability, what we see in this sort of perspective is really, it's all focused on the individual. And historically, the medical model has obviously been really strongly influential in the disability area. So saying this is all about the impairments of the person who's experiencing the disability, whether that be physical or sensory or mental. And so that impairment is something that needs to be trying to be addressed through some sort of intervention. So essentially the problem, as you can see there with the little arrows on the diagram, are all towards the person themselves. And so the type of interventions that go with that are obviously around trying to cure that impairment or alleviate the effects of that impairment in some sort of way. So obviously at times, there is a room for part of something like this model around addressing some of the impacts or the effects, but very much the philosophy of it in that sense, putting everything back on the person themselves. The charity model is a really interesting one for social work because I think the ambassador mentioned historically in Ireland, where people with a disability might have been placed in institutions or seen to be, you know, in that sense, needing this help in some sort of way. Once again, for social work, historically, have often been quite strongly aligned with charity models, particularly in countries. I think my country, Australia, would have a similar history to Ireland, where a lot of the early services around disability and supports around disability were based within church-based organisations, so parts of the churches. And so in this sense, this charity model sees people with disabilities needing to be helped in some sort of way, unable to help themselves. Non-disabled people are doing good by assisting the people with disabilities. And so once again, a model that has had a lot of influence historically. When we see it in our modern times, there obviously is something to be taken from this model as well, where we see this can be about accessing key services, etc., such as accommodation or other things, and to have some useful role in enabling some independence, but still a very deficits-focused sort of model of thinking about disability, and something that I think for social work we definitely need to have moved on from. The social model, and as we might expect, this fits very well with a sort of a social work perspective. And so, and in many respects, the social model has been supported by the more recent focus on human rights within the disability sector as well. And so if we see the little diagram there, it's almost the reverse, where we're seeing the focus of this is not so much on the individual who's experiencing the disability, but what are the barriers within society that in fact impact on their ability to be part of that society, to participate and to be experiencing all that everyone can from within society. So it does very much look to saying, what are the barriers that are there in place? And in fact, you know, these barriers change over time. But you know, when we look at some of the historic things around physical disabilities, it can be around inaccessible buildings, language, services, communication. Really importantly, and can also be about attitudes. And so what are the barriers that attitudes put in place? If we're talking about the employment sort of sector and workforce participation, you know, a lot of the barriers can be from potential employers not understanding what some of those benefits are going to be from employing people with disabilities, or feeling like there may be more safety issues if they're employing people who are experiencing disability. So the sort of discrimination that then goes with that. So social model, really important one for social work, obviously to be seen as a way of framing this, and to be looking at what are those barriers, how can they be addressed, advocating for change around those barriers to see what can actually be changed to increase the likelihood that people can experience that workforce participation. And then what's traditionally, I guess, seen as the fourth broad model around disability is the human rights model, which acknowledges the impact of disability impairment on people's lives, but that they require more than just removing the barriers, in fact, that's there in the social model. Disabled people's rights need to be protected. It's everyone's responsibility to uphold these rights, and uses a human rights framework to bring about positive change. And so once again, a really important one for us as social workers to be aware of and to incorporate within our practice approaches. So very much that social model as well as the human rights model to be advocating for those human rights, but also to be ensuring that people are not having those human rights abused in some sort of way. So where we start to see some of this for countries, I think the ambassador mentioned in the EU, so certainly there's been a lot of work in there. For countries outside the EU, a lot of the human rights area of disability has been driven by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability. So both Thailand and Australia, where I come from, are signatories to this UN convention. And what that has meant is that countries are supposed to then, from signing on to this convention as a UN convention, to develop laws, to develop processes and policies that then will be consistent with that signing on of the convention. So putting into law that people can't be discriminated against because of their disability, that they should have equal and open access to employment, etc. So within that convention, there's a couple of articles that are particularly relevant to this area of participation in work. So Article 27, which is all about work and employment, the rights of people with disabilities to work on an equal basis to others, the right to the opportunity to gain a living and to work freely, the right to equitable conditions and to be free from discrimination in the workplace. And also Article 28 there around standard of living. So the right to an adequate standard of living for themselves and their family, including adequate food, clothing and housing. So that's where we can start to see a human rights approach getting put into practice. A little example, I guess, from my own country of Australia, which is, as we've got there, is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability. I think probably a bit similar to what the ambassador was talking about in the Irish context. There's for quite some time in Australia been specific legislation regarding disability discrimination. It's illegal to discriminate against someone in the workplace due to them having a disability. And their government-sponsored programs designed to assist people with a disability to gain employment and income. So in that sense, lots of good things that have been put in place, but we can also see still a lot of work to be done. So even despite all of that and the legislation there, we know, this is data from 2020 in Australia, that nearly 1 in 5 Australians have a disability. So this affects a lot of people, a very large proportion of the population. But still, 16.5% of the adults with a disability live in poverty compared to 10.6% of adults without a disability. So much, much more likely to be associated with that. People with a disability make up 37.9% of the population living in poverty. So that impact in a financial sense is still very much there. And over a third of people with a disability of working age rely on a government pension or allowance as their main source of income, so have still struggled in that sense to be able to become part of the own independent workforce. The final point there, the labour force participation rate for people with a disability is 53.4% compared to 84% of people around the same age. So once again, disparities in that access to the labour force. So still in that sense, even with very much a human rights approach, a social model of disability in the context of Australia here, still lots of work to do around increasing those participation rates for people with a disability. So from this quick little run through, my final slide is really then looking at a social work perspective on this. So many of our social work strengths-based approaches and person in the environment approach are consistent with a social and human rights model of disability. So I think very much recognise that we should be looking to those social and the human rights models of disability to guide our practice as social workers in this area, and to look at the approach we should be taking. Working to overcome the barriers to employment through support, advocacy and legal and human rights frameworks. So in working with people who are experiencing a disability, so looking at the lack of work, highlighting discriminatory practices, difficulties in negotiating adjustments in the workplace. And so once again, in the Australian context, it's the law that there should be adjustments in the workplace to enable reasonable adjustments to allow people to be able to work if they have particular disabilities, but not always will that be carried through, not always will it be honoured by particular employees, so the need to advocate around those areas. And then sometimes difficulties in accessing the necessary skills and training. I didn't have it on that other slide there, but we often see similarly that people who experience different disabilities also don't have as much access to education or to as high a level of education and skills training as the general population. What we can see from a social work highlighting for employers is complying with their legal requirements, lack of knowledge or confidence in how to employ workers with a disability. So once again, things that as social workers we can be aware of, and linking people in and ensuring people's rights are being maintained about that. And then most importantly, advocating and acting on instances of discrimination or exploitation that are sort of linked to this area. So in summary, contemporary models of disability, such as the social model and the human rights model, are really important for us to be aware of as social workers, and about their potential for increasing the participation in work of people experiencing disabilities. And then really to hammer on that point again that I think the ambassador made as well, that there's many, many potential benefits for all levels. So for individuals with the disability, for employers, and for the broader community by having a strong workforce participation of diverse groups in those workplaces. So thank you.
For Professor, please, the floor is yours, everyone. ค่ะเชิญค่ะ
Hi, good morning, His Excellency, Mr. Professor. So I have a question, very quick one. So, what would you say as the procedures for navigating on how to include disability people into the workforce? Because oftentimes we hear that this is people, they think that including these people is about the costs of investment. It requires a double job to do this thing, not just a normal workforce. So what would you say to them in one practical solution for people, especially in the business sector, to invest in these diverse talents? Thank you.
My advice would be do it. Do it because it's an investment that makes sense. There might be short-term costs in making the adjustments or providing the accommodations that are required. But, in 10 or 15 years, when your business, your enterprise becomes known and recognized as a diverse workplace, as a workplace that welcomes diversity and inclusion and different perspectives, it will bring all sorts of improvements and all sorts of benefits in terms of productivity, in terms of profitability, in terms of attractiveness as a place to work. That will bring all sorts of talent to your doorstep. So that investment is worthwhile. Also, I think the second point, and I hope this is as compelling an argument in Thailand or will be as it has been in Australia or Europe or elsewhere, do it because it's the law. Do it because you're required to do it. And it's almost like the climate change arguments and companies that, are now having to look at being green or looking at being sustainable. You can either be a laggard, and you'll just lose out, or you can be at the forefront and you can gain the kudos for doing it. But the laws and the requirements are going to be there, and you're going to have to do it eventually. So you might as well be an early adopter and do it and get the benefits and get the credit for doing it.
Australia.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for your stories. I think it is very inspiring, and the course, the professional course that you've, to reach this pinnacle of being the ambassador and the representative of your country. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you've navigated, the requests that you've made upon your condition, because I think to that extent, it's very hard if you're the only one experiencing this situation. And then was it a matter of also circumnavigating the institutional sort of boundaries? Can you tell us a little bit more about that process of making requests, of asking for assistance?
Thank you for your kind comments, and thank you for the question. Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and by no means a linear one. As I said, certainly in the early phase of my career, my instinct was to hide my challenge, not reveal it, not share it, and try to manage it privately. And that entailed, believe me, an extraordinary amount of work and effort. I mean, literally, the only assistive technology I could think of to use was literally using the enlarge function on a photocopier, and literally getting documents and blowing them up and taking them away and reading them in private. Trying to avoid reading documents in front of people because I had to hold them so close to my face, and it was so embarrassing when everyone would say, you need to get your eyes tested, or you should be wearing glasses, when I knew that wasn't an option for me and so forth. But I was trying to hide it because I didn't want to draw attention to it. I didn't want to stand out as being different, because I thought that's going to disadvantage me. That's going to create problems for me. But gradually, and as I went on through my career, I became more confident, and also at the same time, as I said, the technological landscape was changing for the better, the legislative landscape was changing for the better, the social landscape was changing for the better, and all of these things enabled me and empowered me to ask for what I was entitled to ask for my rights more and more. Until it got to the stage where I was able to get help from civil society organizations to identify the technologies that would help me, go to my employers and the word demand sounds very strongly, but because there wasn't any resistance by that stage, ask for the technologies, and whether it was special software, whether it was special computer equipment, whether it was special communications equipment, they were more than willing to provide it. I suppose ironically, one of the slight issues that mitigate against me was that we have now very strong data protection legislation in Ireland and Europe as well to protect the privacy of the individual. So it almost was as if, you know, the information about me having a disability was kept so secure and private within the organization that anytime I had to go back and ask for, you know, upgraded equipment or whatever, it was almost as if it was a fresh request, because they were so careful to lock away the data on any previous request or whatever, that created a slight challenge. But so I think importantly for me, as I said, I had the confidence to talk about it, to share it, to let people know I had a disability, and I was very encouraged that, you know, certainly by the time we get to, you know, into the 2000s and the 2010s, you know, it's no longer something that people react to, and certainly younger generation react to as a cause of, you know, sort of difference or pity or shame. You know, I think the newer generation are much more accepting, much more tolerant, much more positive about, you know, accepting and engaging with diversity, difference, equality and inclusion than my generation were before. So almost just by the evolution of society, life has become easier since then. But it's been challenging, you know, all the way along, and even still today, it's challenging, and it never gets easy. And one of the things that really is, all through my career, perhaps less so now, but certainly my career, the amount of effort, the amount of time that had to go into basic things. It would take me 3 or 4 times longer to read a newspaper article or a document than it would for somebody with let's say, normal vision, inverted commas. It would take me, you know, longer to prepare for example, if I had to speak, you know, most people would just write out a speech and read their notes down and read them. I had to write it out. I had to memorize it because I couldn't read my notes in a form like this. So again, there's much more effort involved in everything. So it is tougher. You know, it is still difficult. Even with all the laws and all the accommodations and all the adjustments that society and organizations can make, there's still an extra burden. It's never going to be a completely level playing field for somebody with a disability, even more so for people with, you know, mobility disabilities and so forth. But it has to be as level a playing field as it can be, and I think we've all got to speak about that and demand that as much as we can. And social workers and people in your fields have all got to, you know, help us, and as David said rightly, be advocates and be champions and be voices for people who don't necessarily have or feel comfortable about using their voice themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very touching. When I went to grad school in the States, I went to international relations and public policy school. And most of my American friends work for Department of State and career diplomats and in other countries as well. I have never seen one as a career diplomat to have this such physical challenge that could be successful. So thank you very much for passionately sharing, and some people might never heard of your story before. I hope, if you don't mind, we could share this video in the future for learning purposes. So thank you very much. Dr. Rose, do you have any question or comments before we wrap up? Because the other session's waiting. All right. So we'd like to thank both speakers so much for today. We look forward to having you again, maybe in the future. Thank you so much. Why don't we all give them a round of applause, please? All right, okay, and I will begin the next session soon, and one of my staff will walk you out, sir. Thank you, we'll send you. Thank you so much, Ka. Okay, good luck. Apologize for the hiccup. Thank you. Great to hear.
นี่ผมอยู่ในระบบนี้ครับผมพูดเนี่ย มันก็ไม่ได้ออกลำโพงอะไรพี่ครับ
เช็คครับ สวัสดีครับ สวัสดีครับ เช็คสัญญาณเสียงครับ ได้ยินชัดเจนไหมครับ ถ้าได้ยินชัดเจนรบกวนตอบไมค์หน่อยนะครับ
ชัดเจนค่ะ
ครับผม ขอบคุณมากครับ สวัสสวัสดีครับ ห้องประชุมครับ ในห้องประชุมไม่ได้ยินเสียงในห้องประชุมเลยนะครับ อ๋อเอ่อลูกพี่เปิดไมค์ในซูมด้วยครับ รบกวนกดเปิดไมค์ในซูมที่คอมพิวเตอร์ครับ ครับ ได้ยินไหมโอเคครับ ได้ยินชัดเจนครับ ได้ยินผมชัดเจนไหมครับได้ยินชัดเจนเรียนไปลองพูดมาเรื่อยๆสวัสดีครับ ทดสอบนะครับ1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 0สวัสดีครับ ทดสอบห้องประชุมนะครับลำโพงห้องประชุมครับได้ยินครับได้ยินโอเคครับเอ่อเสียงของพี่มันมันน่าจะดังไปครับพี่เสียงผมมันน่าจะดังหน่อยใช่ครับผมเสียงผมมันน่าจะดังแล้วมันต้องปรับตรงไหนอาจจะเบาตรงออกลงหน่อยพี่90ใช่ครับผมก็จะเรื่องชวนได้แล้วตรงนี้มันไม่มีที่อยู่เดี๋ยวเราหมุนแล้วดูนะโอเคมันล็อกแล้วแล้วก็เป็นไงบ้าง เอาเมื่อกี้น้องลดลงไม่ได้มองยังน้องมันได้หรือยังครับสัญญาณเข้ามาบันทึกเข้าใหม่ได้ครับสัญญาณเข้ามาบันทึกเข้าใหม่ได้ครับสัญญาณเข้ามาบันทึกเข้าใหม่ได้ครับสัญญาณเข้ามาบันทึกเข้าใหม่ได้ครับสัญญาณเข้ามาบันทึกเข้าใหม่ได้ครับสัญญาณเข้ามาบันทึกเข้าใหม่ได้ครับสัญญาณเข้ามาบันทึกเข้าใหม่
All right, okay, financial literature, let's start. Okay, financial stability, the room is ready. No, it's not your room. Pity. For the morning, right?
Yeah.
Afternoon.
Yeah, for afternoon.
Yeah, but then right now focus on here first. Okay, so the second one is now ready. For the second session, we have wonderful speaker, economists, and PDI, and Dr. Wong and connect. All right, folks, we'll be closing. Yeah, please join us. Come on. Yep. So that we can close the door soon. All right, now you turn to try.
Yeah, thank you. It's rainy. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the day from public policy to personal finance. And here with us today we have two speakers, Community and Dr. Brian Kennedy. As the moderator, we have Dr. Kirila. Dr. Pawa is currently the director of the Economic Intelligence Service of the Thailand Development Research Institute. Her specialization is spans monitoring and analyzing development of the global of Thai economies. Dr. Kiba was a senior economist and the country economist for Thailand of the World Bank Group. Dr. Kiba had a PhD in economics from Cornell University. Please give a warm applause for Dr. Kiba.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. And hello to everyone online as well. Thank you, Louis, for introducing me. So in this panel, it's going to be a follow-up from the session just now where we talk about personal finance. But I like to think of it more as financial stability at a personal level, which is quite important. It encompasses a lot of elements, which I will ask both of the panelists to discuss from their point of view. But first of all, let me just introduce them to you first, who they are. Well, on my far left, the handsome gentleman is Dr. Brian Kennedy. Dr. Brian Kennedy is actually a New Yorker. He's born in New York City, and he has a PhD from the George Mason University. That's right. That's where you met your wife, because that's well, his wife and I are friends. So, just to make it light and lively. And he has a PhD in economics and specializing in public choice and economic history. Dr. Kennedy has also been working at the USAID, or the U.S. Agency for International Development. He was with the Office of Population and Family Planning, but now he's based in Bangkok, and he's a lecturer at Thammasat University since 2009. So that's Dr. Kennedy. And next to me is Kun Nikki. Kun Nikki is a former PR, public relations director, with a passion for strategic branding communications. She's been doing this for 8 years. Kun Nikki is currently a diversity, equity, and inclusion communicator, advocating for LGBTQ and more, economic empowerment, inclusive workplace, transgender professional leadership in both national and international stages. So let me welcome both of them to this session. So in this first round, I'd like you to share your views, from your perspective of how do you see financial stability at a personal level. Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Oh, they can't on Zoom, so. Okay. Okay, so I thought I was going to have a lot more undergraduates here, so I was going to yell at them like I was their mom, but I'm going to make this point really quickly. How to save your money is a complicated question. Do you put it into land? Do you invest in a car so you can get a better job? Do you put it into short-term government securities, CDs, stocks, equity? How do you, okay, all of these questions are complicated. What's not complicated is, should you save? Okay. If an aunt dies and she leaves you 100,000 baht, what do you do with it? What you should do is maybe replace your phone with the new one and take the other 80,000 baht and save it. Okay. And I think almost everyone in this room kind of knows that, but the younger people don't. And the way people avoid this is they turn it into a complicated question. Well, I'm not, all the people who I get asked a lot about savings and personal finance by a lot of my friends. And I noticed at a certain point, they're always asking me complicated questions about what to do when they start saving. And so I just got in the habit of telling them, no, I'm not answering this. Save your damn money for 3 years. That's the hard thing. And that's what you need to do. And everybody knows this, but everybody tries to turn it into a complicated question. So that's the first thing, just save your money. Second thing is, once you are saving your money, that's when you need to start making plans. Once you, my rule of thumb, once you have 3 to 6 months of salary in the bank, you're at that point where you need to start addressing the more complicated questions as to what you're going to do with it. My main advice, therefore, to get started, just divert 20% of your income if you're 20 to 30. Divert 20% of your income into an account other than the one that you normally use. And then don't touch it for 6 months. And then after 6 months, figure out what you're going to do to deal with it. A good rule of thumb is you should have 6 months' salary in the bank, fairly readily accessible. That will cover most major medical expenses. That will cover suddenly losing your job. Beyond that, invest longer term. Okay? That's when you start thinking, well, buying a house, can you make that cheaper than rent over the long term? That's when you look at maybe mutual funds or some kind of stock investment decision. That's when you start making those other complicated questions. But no one learns the answer to the complicated questions until they have enough money to need to. Well, I'm speaking to the choir. Everyone in this room at this point knows you should save money. And therefore, my advice to everyone in this room, save 10% more than you are. And you'll thank me in 20 years.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think what Dr. Kennedy has just said is a good example of someone with very good financial literacy. That's what we call, right? I mean, knowing, how to manage your personal finance. And of course, there are a lot of theories, there are a lot of practical ways. How much should you save? How much you invest? What should you invest in if you're between 20 to 30? What should you invest in if you are 50 to 60? So, there's a lot of things that you can do by educating yourself on financial literacy. And I think that's a very important point that Dr. Kennedy, would you like to add anything?
Oh, there we go. By the way, this is a case of do as I say, not as I did. Okay. I showed up in Thailand at the age of 40 with a lot of student debt. And I have, for the last 20 years now, been making up ground really quickly. I save about 50% of my money and have been since I got here, because I did not do my money very smart when I was younger. So just do as I say, not as I did.
Right. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really, underlined the importance for, being careful, being more prudent, and, being more knowledgeable on your personal finances. So that's very important. Thank you so much, Kennedy, for those comments. What about you, Kuniki? From your point of view, how do you see financial stability at the personal level? What are the elements you think, or what are the challenges that you see?
Well, to begin with, I'm inspired from Dr. Kennedy. Education when we are so young. was last year, and last year, how the education system share education person life Jesus to empower the generation to situation as just like education just I was turned 30. But to tackle to earn that as well. So that's why I have a choice that earn, save, and invest. Open to try as the presenter. So that's your first one. Earning. It's also very challenging for to a lot of the people in Thailand to earn the especially having match to have to scale with access to financial and stability. So I think this is the situation.
Right. It was very important what Kuniki just said is that, you know, when you talk about financial literacy, it's not only how you save and invest, but you also have to think about how do you earn your money, how do you diversify your risk, right? In earning the, you know, in getting your income, because in the future, there's so many uncertainties, not only from the pandemic, but from the global, you know, economic uncertainties, high prices, geopolitical tensions. So again, you know, it's very important that you also look at the, you know, at the earnings side as well. And how do you manage that, right? So that's very important. Dr. Brian, before Kuniki comes back to say what are the challenges for the group that she represents, is there anything else you want to mention as an economist in terms of how do you actually manage these risks or cope with the challenges?
Sure. Okay, well, first I'm going to say, how do you maximize your earnings / minimize your expenses? And there's, in the US data, it's pretty clear that there are two things you need to do. Finish school and don't marry the wrong person. Okay, those are the two key things. And I kind of think for a lot of people, don't marry the wrong person is the more important of the two. Although it depends on the field, and Thailand, I tend to think that getting a degree is probably a little more important than the US because so many people in the US have degrees now. But those are kind of the two things. If you if those two things work for you, two people can live two people living together can live a lot cheaper than two people living apart. The rule of thumb in the US is 4 people living in a family can live on the same amount of income as 2 people living alone. It's kind of the square, and then 9 people, the same as 3 people. It's kind of a square root rule. As far as managing risk and things like that, I can't, without knowing a lot of your specifics, I can't necessarily give you great advice, but I can give you some useful advice, which is that we're all dealing with inflation right now, and we're going to be dealing with it for a while longer. The Thai government is starting to do things to fight inflation, but it's limited in how much it can do, because the US is not really fighting inflation, because US fiscal policy is out of control. And now the Federal Reserve is damaging the banking system, so they're very leery of raising interest rates anymore, even though to fight inflation, they still need to. And no matter where they come down on that, I think inflation in the US is going to be persistent for a while longer. If that is correct, the Thai central bank only has so many tools that it can use to fight inflation, because your central bank has an informal semi-peg to the dollar because of the exchange rates and stuff. So, and okay, this gets really complicated, and I don't know all of it myself. I just know that the US seen well enough to know we're going to continue to have inflation. What this means for you is that any savings you have in a fixed interest, account is not going to be earning the same kind of returns as before. It'll look like it is, but 100 baht next year can only buy what 90 baht can buy this year if you have 10% inflation. So your effective savings rate is going down. This is, by the way, is happening to me because since I live in Thailand, I'm not getting any Thai pensions or anything like that. That's part of why I save so much. And I'm obviously not going to get much from the US. How do you guard against inflation? The way I've done it is through property. Okay, my wife and I bought, for less than 1 million baht, we bought a small Chinese row house. We renovated it. Then we turned around and we rented out. And our target is a young couple with their first kid, because they don't want to live in an apartment anymore. So we made them a nice little house, and hopefully they'll come and stay there for 5 years and never bother me. So that's sort of our model, but we've got things in other areas as well. And this is very traditional advice. Property is a good hedge against inflation. The one caveat I would put to that is that we don't know what a world with falling population is going to look like. Once population starts falling, well, then we don't need as many houses and apartments as we had before. And that could lead to property no longer being a good hedge against inflation. I'm going to guess for the next 20 years, it still will be. And I don't think I'll live too much more than another, well, actually probably 100 years, I hope. I'm an optimist. But actuarially, I'm not going to live another 100 years. So this is not a thing I have to worry about that much. So it's just something I'm curious about. It is probably something that those of you who are younger than me ought to at least bear in mind as you're going forward. So that's my main financial advice. Divert some of your money so that you never see it, get enough money to have to invest it, then try and hedge against inflation, at least for the next several years. And I'm not going to predict any further than that.
Thank you so much. I think one of the key points that Dr. Kenny has pointed out is that inflation is here to stay, right? And inflation means that prices are rising compared to the year before. So even inflation this year in Thailand, which the Bank of Thailand forecast is 3%. I'm a macroeconomist, so these are things I actually look at quite a bit, right? On average, it'll be 3% inflation compared to 6% last year. But it means that prices are rising by 3%, right? So 3% higher than last year, and maybe next year will be another 3% higher. So, prices are going to are here to stay. High prices are here to stay. So how do you actually, find enough earnings, right? And you invest or save for your future. That's very important. So you need to really plan ahead. What about you, Kuniki? You were mentioning that you would like to also mention some of the challenges that the group that you represent faces. And then we'll come back to our final round on what are your recommendations, for individuals or for government policies, to tackle these challenges, please.
Okay, so just to continue from what happened to because of the situation. So what is so from that, I would see research. That well. So this kind of statistics is not happening only at a but RGB as well, like it's sexual of to yes, so that can wrong. The system so I think this is a problem. For example, like studies. The system. From the system, we have access to so that you have ability for them to at least innovate. So for the future, lack of access to workplace benefit, for example, healthcare, which was very higher because of or for example, the human, for example, situations this is very good initiative. So things that have a capability, you can get access to this tests, right? Even the plan, these are very important. So not only have to be secure, but how people, how people should have understand Parliament, now because we have the security. As a conceptual and also on the systemic so we are facing having a standard concrete action and practical solution and practical solution in collaborative approach between government and private sector and community to find include them from this system, include them and find the solution is right. To address the point.
This is a very good point because, everybody wants, right, to develop themselves. They want to work if they're given the opportunity. But Kaniki is saying that now there's so many barriers and discrimination that, people who want to be more financially stable, they actually want to work, but they can't really do that up to their potential because there's discrimination in the workplace, for example, access to healthcare benefits, for example, it's not equal. So that also limits, right, the ability for people to actually work, to their full potential as well if you're not in your perfect health. So, or even a good health. So these are things that I think are very important as well, when we were talking about financial stability that one can maintain on a personal basis. What about you, Dr. Kennedy? What are the recommendations you would have? You have made many recommendations on managing your, an individual's personal finance. But as you see, there's many things in the environment that's also affecting this. What are the recommendations?
Okay,
yeah,
sure. Well, step one, you can control your own personal finance. That is within your powers of control for the most part. As long as you have access to the banking system and financial systems, you can basically do that. There are things that the government can do. I think the first most important thing the government should do is get inflation under control. I was surprised when I heard 3%, but that's a forecast.
Well, because we're comparing the price this year to last year, which has peaked. So, of course, comparing this year to last year, the increase in the price level on average for the whole year would be around 3%, according to the Bank of Thailand.
Okay, I'm just wondering because it was more than 3% last year. I'm certain of that.
Last year was 6.1%. All right.
I would have guessed 10. But yeah, as a consumer, that tends to happen. And as a consumer who buys lots of food, that tends to happen. That was where it was really high. Okay, so you can control your own personal finances. If the government can get inflation under control, that brings price stability. Now it's a lot easier to make plans for these kinds of things. What the government should be doing, to the extent that it is excluding any groups from financial services, that should end. That there should be legal protections for that. There's no real reason I can think of to be excluding groups, other than sometimes it's just non-economical to serve very, very poor groups because the transaction costs of managing very low transaction savings accounts and things like that can be high. But with computers and stuff, I don't think that's a big deal anymore. So I think that they should be doing that. I think that they should have improved public education. That's a tough thing to do, but I think that that is one area where Thailand really is lagging. And how you do that, I would argue for school vouchers or something like that. But I almost feel like most investments the Thai government makes in the realm of public education would probably be good. Beyond that, I don't have a lot of concrete solutions. I just think macroeconomic stability and property rights and let the country keep developing. As long as Thailand is developing at 4 to 5% a year, you have a growing economy, and all problems are easier when the economy is growing. If the pie is getting bigger, the fights about dividing it up are about dividing up the profits, so to speak. Those fights are way more politically peaceful and simple than fights about a stagnant or shrinking pie. The other thing I will say, and I'm sorry, you invited an economist, so you're going to hear an economist from George Mason, so you're going to hear this. And for the record, what I'm going to say is the exact same thing I would say about America. The Thai government wastes about half the money that it gets. And that is probably a good thing. Think of the things that they could screw up if they had more money. And that, as a public choice economist, is how I kind of look at these things. I think social society is where these kinds of changes and stuff come from. To the extent now that trans people are being excluded from these various things, I think that actually, I think Thailand deals with its trans population fairly well, all things considered, but I only really have America to compare it to, so I could be mistaken about that. Yeah, I guess that's the thing. Give people the opportunity, and then work on the social situations that people don't discriminate. Okay.
Thank you. One of the points that Dr. Brian makes is right, that if the pie gets bigger, then, of course, people should be able to get a bigger share of the pie, individually. But of course, in Thailand, we have a lot of issues with distribution as well, because those who will be able to capture the pie are usually those who are not discriminated, those who have opportunities, those who have more access to finance, right? So just turning to Nikki again, what will be your recommendations to address some of these challenges that you have mentioned?
Welcome to recommendation. Let me also share some idea of what you the doctor mentioned as well about how the government the transportation on LGBTQ. Well, in 2015, so, I think 5 years to like to increase it's like 5 years. Actually, the discrimination is still there in Thailand. And the top discrimination is people. I think outside the perspective, I think I would give a thing that I will have to be in things that they are so accepted in society, but it's on ground. For people on media and thinking about so welcome and this one good. I'm saying that we can something better as well. I'm saying actually question industry. That's true what happened to the reality. Where you go to do the show, for example, it's got you go to and you sell user services. Or even some people sexual attraction argument. How does it feel to do? It's not about them as a capital human security because to these people. Sure, you should have a mindset. Because that where people your competencies for your business growth. Especially once the share ambition, right? But people don't get this concept and why. So that's a show is happening. It's still a lot of liberal grab happening that has to discriminate. It's very hard and stigmatized. As in the society. So I think that also like in the financial industries you see and policy of financial services. I think when action that could like something by increasing the concentration of large and micro people in the hiring process in the organization. So when you hire these people, and you can understand how you can systems in the leadership position. How you can grow this community to be to discuss and find a political solution. I think this is a challenge. The commission from this is sector to be inclusive. I think government can be the children in that conversation. I think that could be what people have on how we could work this country to be more inclusive as it states.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I fully understand what you're trying to say, because as a woman, we also have those challenges as well, right? In organizations, in public policies. There's a question. If any of you here have a question, please be ready with your question, because we only have 5 minutes left for our session. But there's a question from Zoom asking what would be your thoughts on the role of the Ministry of Social Development and Human Security in addressing these issues. Of course, realizing that we have a lot of government spending and high public debt already. So I think this person is trying to ask what are the measures that we can take into account without having to spend much more into solving them. Any of you would like to address that?
Could you repeat the question? I want to make sure I'm answering.
Yes. So what should be the role of the Ministry of Social Development and Security to address these issues that we're discussing about, given that the country's public debt is already very high?
Again, I would argue education. As a general rule, and this, okay, so trans issues is not something I'm that familiar with. What I am familiar with is government and how government operates and how government bureaus act, the bureaucracy, electoral politics. That's the area where I have expertise. And in my experience, government is a lagging variable. Okay, society changes first. Once society has changed, government policy tends to follow that with some sort of a lag. And I'll give the example. Well, I'll give the U.S. example. Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, all supported the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. All four of them in 2008 were against gay marriage. Okay. All of them are for it now, but they were not willing to get ahead of the issue before the American public started to. And I think that's the key thing. Acceptance has to come from individuals. And therefore, I think education is one, not that expensive compared to a lot of other things. And two, change hearts and minds, and then other government policies will follow. That's kind of my perspective on it.
Thank you.
Happy for to what the person said. I think issue from the business sector. So how we actually see the following things, you're facing a gap between budgetary, the higher policy into complete action and actually activities that are based on outcome based on activity. For example, when we are talking about motivation, so how we can the community should invest in the investment how to formulate this one solution. Because if you don't have any data, you don't like what's around here, this people it's really LGBTQ. People, the solution. Sure, because in something just like talking action. So I think the change will happen. Very normal and perspective security, my friends, human capital, and investing increase my representation of sure that has diverse perspective as mentioned earlier. You have to make sure that not you are going to create a prototype, but also you really understand that you are going to solve all of the Thank you.
Wonderful.
I'll second one for.
Mhm.
Yes, data. Part of my educating myself on all these issues was I tried to gather data. But of course, I'm trying to gather data in the US because, that's the country I know and the language I can speak and stuff. There's so much data in the US and it's all so bad and so politicized and never says what I think it should say or stuff. And I mean, that's just a travesty. Okay, there ought to be good data, and there isn't coming out of the US or any other Western country at this point, because the issue has become so politicized in a variety of different ways. Thailand, I don't think you have a whole lot of data. If you might, and I can't access it. And if you do, well, then still get more, because that's going to be needed to make any kind of an intelligent policy decision. Okay, that's all.
Thank you. Any questions from the, oh yes, Kunwana, please. Okay, one microphone for now.
Thank you very much, all the panelists and Dr. Kirida as a wonderful moderator. Given that the inflation is still ongoing, it's not as skyrocketing in the past year, and it was ongoing. Gas price still consider high, and food price are not coming down at all. I mean, even if something is getting a little bit better or stable. And for elderlies, like just I mentioned this morning, that pension is, if they don't work for government, at the most they make 1,000 Thai baht a month they receive from the government. And then everything else consider not equal or increase. How do we deal with this challenge? And we have more aging population, healthcare, and we have less fewer children born, and the labor shortage and such. So what would you recommend that these are the priorities, or this is something we should consider or should do? Thank you very much.
Dr. Brian, do you want to respond to that quickly?
Raise the birth rate, and nobody knows how to do that. I mean, it's the key thing. No one knows how to raise the birth rate. The only developed country in the world at this point that's above replacement fertility is Israel, which is actually, I think, still above 3. But, I'm not going to sit here and say, move next to a bunch of Arab countries and become Jewish. And I don't even know if that has anything to do with it. They're just the one outlier. even the US, which was an outlier for a while, at this point, we're a little bit below replacement fertility, and we'd be a lot below, except for the immigrant community that keeps coming in and having more children on average. So that's, yeah, for the long term, I think that's the key thing. And we're all probably going to have to learn to live in a world where population is shrinking. The good news is that means global warming is not going to be that big of a deal. Once the population is half what it is now, our footprint will be going down just because of that. So that's my happy note. You don't really have to worry about that as much as you do.
No, you want to just quickly? Yeah.
Okay, so I think we need to see like short term and long term. So in short term, for example, we have the population. So I see like in different countries, we have much opportunity for other people to get job. So I think to if you cannot to work now. Access to this group.
Just one quick comment. On the raising the retirement age and providing more jobs for the elderly, I agree. That's something the US should do. In the case of Thailand, it's a little bit trickier. You still have a large rural population engaged in farming. For those, the human body starts to break down at 60. And after 65, for a lot of that rural farming population, they don't have a choice. Their body can't do it anymore. So that's not to say you shouldn't explore it and do it. And I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that it's an issue. People like me, white collar, I can work. I'll work until my brain stops functioning. But for blue collar jobs, and Thailand has a larger percentage, raising the retirement age is a trickier thing to do.
Thank you so much. I think we have run out of time. But if there's one more question, yes, please. Sure. We'll give you the microphone so people can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Anthony. I'm from the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development. Actually, just a couple of comments. Nikki, with regard to working on the private sector, there are many private sectors, especially in the Ministry of Labor, that are in the Ministry of Labor programs, specifically the Department of Labor and Social Welfare, that have many award-winning companies that have programs and policies that do not discriminate. They're still there and they're still active, but it's a lot of work to get in contact with them. And just for general, by the way, these ministries of labor exist in all of our ASEAN countries, and a list of private sectors are with them, specifically on HIV/AIDS. So we can learn on that. The ones that do not discriminate. Unfortunately, the Civil Service Commission has had a non-discriminate. They take them up on that. They seem to be proud and say we've had this since before 1900. So, and we're quite proud of that. So we can take them on that. So the Civil Service Commission is quite good. With regards to the rest of us, whether it's elderly, I would suggest grow your own food. Or find a friend, as I do, who grows their own food and depend on them. Love your neighbor, because that's all you're going to have in the future. And neighbors does not have to be people next door. Your own community, depend on them. Reduce your expenses, and you can still enjoy life. I drive a motorcycle. I'm not saying I'm great, but I've been doing that for 40 years, every day. Second-hand clothes, and it's like the circular economy, and things of that sort of in our region. And I'm not this person to say, I'm a good person at doing this, but it's the second-hand clothes that I'm wearing. You can have more. It's cheaper, and for the rest of us, including people in power and people in ASEAN, and people in positions of power, recheck your own values. Whether you're LGBTQI or ethnic minority or disability, we all have to recheck our own values. To see each other as a person rather than to see each other as a category. So I'd just like to, yes, thank you.
That's really a wonderful ending to this session. Thank you so much. So I think we have run out of time, but I just want to say two things before we end. Is that I would just like to thank both of you, the panelists, so much for inspiring us, on financial literacy. And I think it's important is that both of you could actually lead by examples. And I think everyone here can actually lead by an example of, how do we practice financial literacy? How do we practice a non-discriminatory practices in our organization? So I'd like to really thank all of you here so much. And I hope that, in the future, we will have to talk less about this issue and more about other issues such as how do we, handle the aging society here in Thailand, which perhaps has to do with many of these issues as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone here, and I'd like to close this session right here. And I think we'll have to go for lunch in a bit. Thank you so much. Thank you.